Last week we didn't quite get through with some more of our effects that the flood has had upon humankind, and I want to go back and pick up with the sixth one, which was the last one that we had been on, concerning the covenant. Wasn't that the last thing that we were on? The covenant that God had given. And then I was going to have some additional time to go into one of our other fourfold areas, but I think we'll introduce some other subjects. I was doing some more reading along this line the past week, and there seems to be still so much confusion over the pre-fall and post-fall and pre-flood and post-flood world that we've got still too many evangelical Christians that hold to some form of uniformitarianism, that we've got a progression of things from the simple to the complex, and that relatively speaking, what we see in the world today is basically the way that it's always been. And they just can't seem to handle things that we just made comments about before that we're going to spend more time proving, such as, just to give you an example, some of the structural changes that took place in man, in animals, in plants, in the whole world, and in all areas. They can't seem to handle things like that because of their first law of thermodynamics. There is no creation of energy, and energy is not destroyed. And if we've got, again, just to give you an example, if we have got by, I admit, not clear teaching, but by clear, nonetheless, implication in Genesis 3, a serpent who at one time walked uprightly, and from Genesis 3 and verse 14 until the present day no longer walks in this way, that he has had to have some type of structural changes as far as his physiology and anatomy is concerned. And with the popular belief in the first law of thermodynamics, something like that simply couldn't have taken place because that involves creation. Of course, then all of Genesis 1 couldn't have taken place because all of that involves creation. But if you somehow adopt some type of form of evolutionary thought or uniformitarianism, you can do away with all of these things that we come up against, such as the various colors of the animals that we've mentioned before. Generally your male species are more outstanding, or frequently your male species in their color and a lot of other features about them, they're more outstanding than the females. Now obviously this wasn't in creation. There was no predators, so you didn't need camouflage. You didn't have anything or anyone to hide from. So it had to have come about at some later time. And we'll get into this in the next few weeks, but we want to just discuss some basics tonight. But before doing that, we need to go back to our effects that the flood has had upon mankind. And the sixth one that we were on concerned the covenant that God gave to all flesh, Genesis 9, verses 8 through 11. And specifically to humankind, Noah and his family, and therefore all the descendants that would have been in both the loins of Noah and that of his 3 sons, that there would no longer be a universal catastrophic flood as we've just seen in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. Isaiah 54:9, along with that, and chapter 6, verses 17 to 19. I don't know if I gave you that text last time. Let's go back to the one in Genesis 9. You see, Genesis 9 is divided up into 2 halves. The first 17 verses, you've got God conversing with Noah, and this, of course, is where we spent most of our time in finding some of the effects that the flood has had upon mankind. A lot of these here in the first 17 verses. Beginning with verse 18 on through the end of the chapter 9 of Genesis, then you have some more future accounts of Noah as well as his 3 sons. But this first half of chapter 9 is very important because of some of the effects and some of the changes that we see. We looked at things like man being allowed to eat meat and capital punishment, and some other things that are clearly taught here in Genesis 9. And all of these things taught on the basis of the flood having just occurred in the preceding chapter. God spake unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you. So you see, dear friends, we are part of Noah's seed. He's not talking about his grandson and his great-grandson. He's talking about his seed, which would pass all the way down till today. You see, every time that you sit down and enjoy one of those, well, if you're not up to par in your level of faith, we could say just a McDonald's hamburger. You're not really eating meat, you're mostly eating vegetables, soybeans, but we'll pretend that it's meat for a moment. Or if you're a little higher in your level of faith, you might be enjoying some big roast or steak or something like that. You need to remember when you eat these things that you're eating it because of the allowance that God gave after the flood. In other words, eating meat should remind an individual, it should remind a Christian of the flood. Because that was the one dividing point in history whereby after you've got the flood in its account, then God does allow us to eat meat. And I'm not always conscious of that, but sometimes you ought to be conscious of the fact that as you're enjoying meat, remember that this came about as a result of the flood, that if we'd not had the flood, we'd not have this allowed. We'd still be out there on all four eating grass, or on a ladder picking leaves out of the tree, or however you would have gone about eating vegetables. But you need to call these things to mind. The same thing is true with any time you see a great flood. It won't be the great flood. I'm talking about a great flood like the one in Pennsylvania in the 1880s that destroyed, I think around 2,000 people, that they're just celebrating an anniversary of it here. You need to remember the covenant that God gave, that had He not given that covenant, perhaps that flood that went through Pennsylvania also would have taken Minnesota and Texas and California. It might have taken everything. But on the basis of the covenant that He gave, there no longer be a universal destruction by flood water. You might need to know that because you might be stranded out sometime where here come the flood waters, and just remember the covenant that it's not going to cover all things, and you just confess you'll be one of those things that it won't cover. I remember someone giving the testimony one time, and I remember the testimony because I was in a place one time where they predicted that the same thing would happen, but a family was out camping, tent camping, and they had, of course, generally you camp by a river. We were camped by a river at this time, and I was remembering this testimony here because it was raining and raining and raining there. And I'm not talking about the other people now, a great flood for that area had been predicted that it was going to take everything and everyone away, and you better get out. Well, these were charismatic Christians that decided to use their faith and believe. I don't know what promise, but they probably could have taken Genesis 9 back here, and they decided to stay. And so, of course, not like a motorhome that it could get up 2 feet and you could still drive out. You're caught once you're there. They were in a tent. And once you're there, and they decided to stay. So they just went to bed like you do whenever you're walking by faith. You don't sit up and watch the clock or calendar to make a last-minute escape if you have to. They were trusting God. They got up the next morning, and water was completely surrounding them. The only thing that was not covered by water was their little tent and the floor of the tent, which was nothing but the ground, of course, where they were. It happened to be on just enough of a rise that everything, as far as you could see, was flooded. I guess you realize after a flood, it doesn't take many days, and all that water will head back into the creek bank, and they got out all right, but they stayed there. We were in the same predicament one time. I don't remember all the details of the story. It never did flood like they said it was going to, but we were in a low area like that, and I had to bring that to mind in case we did get in a situation like that. We'd have to trust the Lord. Well, He said, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, and neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of the flood, and neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And if you'll go back to chapter 6, Begin with verse 17. Here we've got a couple of verses that we'd left over from chapter 6 that we had not covered before. Chapter 6, verses 17 and 18 we had not covered before. We've covered all the other verses in chapter 6 and chapter 7, and most of them in chapter 8, and about half of them in chapter 9. But in verse 17, I can point out one thing in going through. Behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. Well, you see the word flood here in verse 17. It's interesting that the only other time in the Old Testament, besides the Noah account of the flood, where this particular Hebrew word for flood occurs, is found over in Psalm 29. Now the word flood occurs in other places, but nowhere does this Hebrew word occur, which means that all the other references to the word flood would not be the Genesis 6, 7, and 8 flood. It's found in the great Voice of the Lord chapter of Psalms, Psalm 29. It's a nature psalm because it is talking about the voice of the Lord. That is the recurring phrase. Verse 3, the voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thundereth. The Lord is upon many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars. Yea, the Lord breaketh the cedars of Lebanon. He maketh them also to skip like a calf. Lebanon and Syrian, like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord divideth the flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shaketh the wilderness. The Lord shaketh the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord maketh the hinds to calve, and discovereth the forest. And in his temple doth every one speak of his glory. The Lord sitteth upon the flood. And there's where the word occurs. Yea, the Lord sitteth king forever. The Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. And here in Psalm 29 and verse 10 is the only other occurrence in the Old Testament of the same Hebrew word that's used to speak of the Genesis Noachian flood of Genesis chapter 6 and verse 17. And of course there in Psalm 29 he does have reference to Noah's flood by speaking of God as the one who sat upon the flood, of course speaking in reference to the fact that the flood damaged everything but him. Back to Genesis 6:18, but with thee will I establish my covenant. We're talking about the covenant now that God has established. And thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. Now there's really no agreement on what covenant he's talking about. The theme of covenants in the Bible is an important theme because God is making covenants with various individuals, and it's always important whenever we see God making a covenant, but there's no agreement on what covenant he's talking about here. There's really about 3 different views on what covenant this could be. And they're in 3 different tenses: the past tense, the present tense, and the future tense. Beliefs on what covenant this is. One belief is that it's some unidentified, unnamed, and therefore unknown covenant that God has made with Noah in the past. Obviously, he doesn't tell us anything about it. He simply says that it's a covenant. Another belief is that it's a covenant that he's making with him right now, and it is the covenant of the preservation of his life to endure throughout the 371-day experience of the universal flood. Now, I can go back and comment on the first belief. If you read the verse, it says, but I will establish. So it's putting it in the future tense, and that'd rule out really the past and the present tense when he says that I will establish. It certainly couldn't have been something past tense, some past tense covenant of which we know nothing that he had made with Noah, we wouldn't be enlightened on the subject at all, and there wouldn't really be a lot of point in including it here in the account of Noah and the flood, since it doesn't even refer to the flood. But more people than not, of course, believe that it somehow refers to the flood, and so they'll adopt the present tense covenant belief and theory here on Genesis 6 and verse 18, that it's the covenant of their natural preservation while on the ark. That certainly doesn't seem to be true, because he's said many, many times here he's going to preserve them, and there'd be no sense in even sending a flood if you're going to destroy everyone. He's not going to start over with a new race. The only thing that can possibly be is that it doesn't have anything to do with past tense. It doesn't have anything to do with their preservation of life. That was already guaranteed to him anyway. He didn't need some special covenant to guarantee his life. That was already guaranteed. The only covenant that can refer to is the future tense one of chapter 9, which is the covenant that restricts any universal judgment in the future to being without the boundaries of water. And of course, we read 2 Peter 3 last time. We know that it'll be within the boundaries of fire, but it'll be outside the boundaries of any type of universal destruction by water. So this is the covenant that he has reference to. Now in Isaiah 54:9, he speaks again of the waters of Noah. We're not going to look at the passage because we've looked at it before, but it does refer to the same account. It's a very interesting verse because you don't see a lot about Noah anywhere else in the Old Testament besides what you see here. I mean, this is the bulk of the material. He is mentioned later on in the New Testament, but even there you don't find out a lot of material. What's been provided has generally been restricted to these early chapters of Genesis. Now, a seventh and final effect that involves mankind is, of course, the token of the covenant. In Genesis 9, verses 12 through 17. Now, he could have said all of this in one verse. I mean, the Great Commission only takes up a couple of verses, and look how many verses are given here just as a token of the covenant. We divide it up between the covenant, verses 8 through 11, and the token, verses 12 through 17. So it must be something that's important as far as God's concerned. I don't know if anyone thinks that the rainbow is pretty. I think it's pretty. I think it has special meaning to it.
Hallelujah. Amen.
I think that it's one of the many things that Satan has perverted in telling us that there's a pot of gold at the end of it. Wonder how that ever got introduced, except that Satan wants to take everything of God's and introduce some perverseness to it, so that it'll rule out all of the intended implications that God wanted it to have. The rainbow has implications, but one of those is not prosperity as far as a pot of gold at the end of it. God says this is the token of the covenant. Now remember, God gave a covenant to Abraham. Abraham's introduced in the end of chapter 11 here of the same book. But over in chapter 15, God introduces a new covenant with Abraham, gives him a token, which was, of course, circumcision. So there are tokens to these covenants that God has given. The cross and the blood of Jesus, the book of Hebrews teaches, is our token for our new covenant.
Hallelujah.
That it was seen in the Old Testament, but couldn't be applied in its full scope and authority as it can after Calvary, when he said in Exodus chapter 12 that when I see the blood, then I'll pass over.
Praise God.
The Passover, of course, was a temporary occasion with them, but we've got a permanent covenant. It's seen, by the way, in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 12 through 14. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. Now remember that the book of Hebrews, such as back in chapter 8, verse 1, as well as over in chapter 10 and verse 1 and other passages, teaches that, or what we see here in the natural world constitutes a representation of what exists in the heavenly realm. But you can't make that literal things that exist, so that Jesus went into a literal temple and offered upon a literal altar his blood or anything like that. In other words, you can have the thought of the spiritual existence of these things as being a reality without them being a reality as far as we know a reality. Anyway, that's another subject. If the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of an heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctified to the purifying of the flesh, then how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. The proof text against many of the false cults that believe that the Holy Spirit is a created being. He's called right here in Hebrews 9 and verse 14 the eternal Spirit, which means that the Holy Spirit's uncreated, just like the Son is uncreated. So here we've got the token of our new covenant, the blood of Jesus. But going back to Noah's covenant, they had another token that still involves us, but it doesn't involve our salvation. This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. Now we're using this, you see it talks about just the earth and all the animals as well as man. We use this as one of the effects we're studying upon man, because obviously a bird's not going to look up and see the covenant and say, oh, I remember Genesis chapter 9 now. It affects them, but not consciously like it affects us. So basically its effect is upon man. That when God sends the cloud, and of course what causes the rainbow? There's always two rainbows. Sometimes you can't see either of them. Generally, if you can see any of them, it's only one, but there's always a primary and there's always a secondary rainbow. And of course, it's a circle, but all you can see is a semicircle or a half moon. But a rainbow is always complete, representing completeness and fulfillment of God's plan. And it shall come to pass that when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. Now, the only way you'll be able to see it is if you've got the cloud with the sun passing through it at the right angle, and you've got, like you worked back in high school chemistry classes or physics classes, working with a prism, light is refracted by the droplets of water that are in the cloud, and therefore it creates these colors of blue and violet and red and yellow and orange and these various colors that God intended for it too. Now obviously there couldn't have been any clouds prior to this time, could there? Or they would have had a rainbow prior to this. And how would that represent anything? It certainly couldn't represent that God would never destroy the world with a flood, because he just did do that. And if the rainbow had existed prior to God destroying the world with a flood, it certainly didn't stop him from destroying the world with a flood at that day. And who's to say he won't do it all over again? In other words, the clouds, the rain, and the rainbow had to be a special introduction after the flood in order for it to be a valid reminder to us and to God, in a sense, that there's no more going to be this type of destruction. Verse 15. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, this is the token of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. You see, he's gone through about a half a dozen verses here, and he could have said all that in one verse. I'm going to give you a token of the covenant, and that token's a rainbow. But he goes through a half a dozen verses to point out that this is a very real rainbow that's going to exist, and it has a spiritual meaning to it. People have dreamed of all types of things, and they use the rainbow, you see, on all types of slogans and advertisements and pictures and dance halls and casinos. You'll see a big rainbow there. There's a pot of gold at the end of it. In Las Vegas, you see, I remember when we were in Las Vegas, you see these rainbows with a pot of gold at the end of it, taking spiritual truths that have spiritual meanings behind it and perverting them. But for a Christian, we should when you see one, you ought to just bow your head and thank God for the token of the covenant that He's given. You know He's given a covenant, but He's given you a proof of the covenant so that you can see with your own eyes. A lot of things, you see, we just have to trust in by faith. But here's one thing He lets us see with our visible eyes to remind Him of what He did and what He'll not do in the future. And at the same time, it'll remind Him. Well, let's go over to the book of Ezekiel. I want to show you where the rainbow appears again in the first chapter of Ezekiel. I can mention as you're turning over there, this is one of the very unique and important aspects of the Christian story of the flood, because this is not found in any of the other legends about a great flood coming on the earth and a couple of people climbed up on a mountaintop and escaped it. Of course, it all derived itself, these legends and theories derived themselves from Noah and from the real account, but they've been paganized and perverted as they've been spread into different cultures and different lands. But one thing that's not been carried anywhere is the rainbow. That is unique to the Christian story of creation. You remember some of the other accounts we've given you. They know about an ark. They know about people being preserved. They know about getting a few animals on board. They know about sending some birds out to see if the land is dry. They know about these different things. But one thing that has yet to be uncovered in the other pagan legends about the flood is the existence of the rainbow. So it's unique to the Christian account. In Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 28, we see God's glory and His majesty being represented by the rainbow. It's really a perfect way to represent God's majesty, as though He were sitting on top of the rainbow, or you could turn it around as though the rainbow were His crown. Either one would represent all of the glory and the splendidness of God and His kingdom. Because there's nothing like a rainbow that people would like to get up to and just touch that. And of course all it is water there, but it is so beautiful. It is so beautiful. As the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain. Exactly, word for word, what is said in Genesis 9. God said, I'll set my bow in the cloud in the day of rain. Well, He said, as the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about the throne.
Hallelujah.
This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake. You want to know, as far as we can tell here from Ezekiel's account, what it looks like around the throne? It looks like a rainbow with just splendid colors that, it's not water, it's not a literal sun shining through them. It's God's glory that can be represented in so many different ways. And here it's represented in just fantastically beautiful colors. And that's not to say that there can't be other colors in that world that aren't in this world.
Amen.
We know about blues and reds and greens and purples. I mean, you can't even think of a color that doesn't exist, or it would exist if you could think of it.
That's right.
It's hard to even think of, all right, now what's the color that we can't see, that we don't know about? But we can't see God and He exists. There can be all types of things there. Just to take the chapter that we're in, Ezekiel 1, there are wheels within a wheel here. We don't see any wheels within a wheel. The only way we can come close to conceiving of what a wheel within a wheel would be like is because we've got about 28 verses on a wheel within a wheel and living creatures. He goes into a lot of detail here. But he doesn't go into detail about the possibility of different colors existing in that world. I mean, we already know what blue and red and green look like. I don't want you to be in for a surprise if you get introduced to a lot of new colors when we get into that world. And of course, we'll probably still be seeing some of these, like red and gold. Gold represents majesty. That's seen over in Revelation chapter 1. So we'll probably see some of these pretty colors. We might not see any gray or black or what we would consider our dull colors. I'd be wanting to look at, I don't know, some lime green. That's pretty outstanding. Or some scarlet red, or pink, or purple, or orange. but magnified 100 times in that world.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Revelation chapter 4 and verse 3, we see the rainbow appearing again. We only see it, I think, about 3 other times in Scripture. Revelation 4 and verse 3. It refers us here back to Ezekiel 1, so they both tie in together. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat upon the throne. And he that sat was to look upon like jasper and a sardine stone. And there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald. Well, we've got some more colors involved right there.
Hallelujah.
It doesn't have to look just like our rainbow. But in other words, it's something that resembles it, and it's something that he couldn't use any other analogy or comparison to show us what it would be like except our rainbow, so it must be something similar to that, like a huge arc that would circle all the way underneath. Because remember, a rainbow is a complete circle. We just never see the end of it. It allegedly goes on, and it finally ends with a pot of gold. But God's throne himself could just be completely encircled with these beautiful, fantastic colors here. I'm reminded of another passage before we go on, back in 1 Timothy, where the continued.
Hallelujah.
It doesn't have to look just like our rainbow. But in other words, it's something that resembles it, and it's something that he couldn't use any other analogy or comparison to show us what it would be like except our rainbow, so it must be something similar to that, like a huge arc that would circle all the way underneath. Because remember, a rainbow is a complete circle. We just never see the end of it. It allegedly goes on, and it finally ends with a pot of gold. But God's throne himself could just be completely encircled with these beautiful, fantastic colors here. I'm reminded of another passage before we go on, back in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 14. There are books out, friends, on the subject of visions that people have had in the other world, and I don't want to get into commenting on how much of it might be true, might not be true. We can speculate and theorize about what that world will look like. It'd be better just to stay with the Word of God. Passages like John 14. Jesus said, in my Father's house there are going to be many mansions. Well, how can you build mansions in a house? If anything, you could build houses within a mansion. But how can you build mansions within a house? You see, most people read John 14 and say, oh, we got mansions up there, and they never think about that. Well, how can you build many mansions in a house then? In other words, he does give us some insight to what it might be like. I remember reading one sister's book on the subject where she had died and gone to the other world and then had come back, and she had lived there for some time before she came back, several days anyway, and the angels took her to her abode, and it had her name on it. And she labors throughout the book in reminding us that it was so beautiful it was hard to put down in writing what it would be like. She could only give us some comparisons. I just remember one of the things that she said was that when she walked in the room, it was just beautiful, just everything was glistening inside. And all around the room there were flowers within the wall. And she said it looked as though, and she said it actually happened while she was there, as a matter of fact, that on the way there the angels had cut some heavenly flowers. She described them as things like roses and tulips, especially something like a rose with a beautiful smell. A tulip doesn't smell a lot, but a rose has a beautiful smell. When the angels walked into the room, they just began throwing these things. And as soon as they threw it, it went right in through the wall, because you see that's another dimension. It went through the wall, but yet didn't go all the way through, and it stuck inside the wall. And the walls were like glass, except you couldn't see through them, though. But they weren't a mirror at the same time. And your rose would be in there, and it would be entrapped in there, so you couldn't get it out, but it also would just give a heavenly fragrance to the whole room. And you can't say things like that aren't true until you've been there to prove that that's not true.
Hallelujah.
I'd rather believe that it is true than believe that it's not. But regardless of whether it is or not, we've got many, many things in store for us in that other world.
Hallelujah.
It's not going to be like an old, worn-out carpet that got the dog hairs all over it in your room. Because the floor is cold to walk on. I mean, we probably won't even have any carpets because the floor won't be cold to walk on.
Hallelujah.
And there won't be dust to collect there because the law of entropy doesn't work in that world.
Amen.
Praise God.
It helps in cleaning the floors if you've got rugs on them. You don't see the dust as bad. We've lived in places where you didn't have rugs on the floor, and you just have to dust the floor like you have to dust the top of your, valet or something, because the dust piles up so thick there. On the floor, it's there, but no one ever notices it. Well, 1 Timothy 6:14. That thou keep this commandment without spot, unrebukable, until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ, which in his times he shall show. So I guess in his times he'll show us these other things too. Who is the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light, which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen, nor can see, to whom be honor and power everlasting. Amen.
Praise God. Hallelujah.
Well, that's probably part of that rainbow that encircles the throne, dwells in unapproachable light. The only potentate, King of kings and Lord of lords.
Hallelujah.
We're not going to be able to do as some people talk about Jesus. Well, he's my big brother, and they treat him as though he were a buddy, a pal, a friend, an army friend or pal or a school buddy or an old chum that they've had. He's the King of kings and the Lord of lords. You won't be able to appear before him and say, hey, old pal, old buddy. I mean, that's the way some people treat him. As though he were a big pal or a big buddy that they might have. No, he's God, friends. He's the Lord of lords and King of kings. And he dwells in unapproachable light and splendidness and glory. Well, back to Revelation, we find our third account in chapter 10 and verse 1 of where the rainbow appears, and this time it appears around an angel. I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven clothed with a cloud. Well, if you got the cloud, then a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open, and he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth. And he cried with a loud voice. That's when a lion roareth. And when he cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, then I was about to write. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. You see, this is one of the ways that you have to go about interpreting the book of Revelation. John's writing about things in another realm, in another world. And they don't have thunders there like we have thunders, but the only thing he can compare what he heard as far as our life is concerned to is the sound of thunder. Because here it said that the thunders in verse 4 said something. I mean, they use words because he said, seal up the things that the 7 thunders uttered. Well, thunders today don't utter anything. It's just that they have a booming, reverberating voice. And so this is the same thing that we see here. One of the keys to interpreting Revelation is to remember that he's not talking about a literal thunder, but he doesn't have any other way to compare the spiritual truth or the other world truth that he wants to get across without coming down to our level and saying, well, he had a face like a lion, he had a face like a bear, he had a face like an eagle. Doesn't mean it has an eagle's long beak with a hook on the end of it and fiery eyes or fangs or something like that. Just doesn't have any other way of comparing it besides bringing something to our mind that we're familiar with. Okay, this gets off the subject now of the effects that we see that the flood has had upon mankind. Next week we're going to begin looking at some of the effects on animals. But in introduction to what we're going to say for the next few weeks, I wonder if you'll turn over to Romans chapter 5. with the time we have left, we want to look at the introduction of the principles and existence of death, adversity, pain, disease, evil, and so forth in the world. We're finding an increasing number of evangelical scholars who simply can't believe the fact that we really had the changes between Genesis 2 and 3 or 3 and 4 that we find in our Bible, or between the pre-flood days in comparison to the post-flood days. They simply believe in some form of evolutionary theory where the things that we see in the world today are pretty much nothing more than a representation of what we've seen in the past. We're going to be looking at some of the most important scriptures that deal with this subject, 3 in particular in the New Testament, 2 in the book of Romans and 1 over in 1 Corinthians, that they mention, but that's about all they do. I guess you realize that there's always some manner in which you can explain away some scripture that doesn't fit your theory.
That's right.
And you can even do it by going to another scripture
Amen.
and in effect make one scripture contradict another. Now, this might get a little difficult, so you might have to write fast whenever we start giving you some of these things, but I want to read from one evangelical Christian scholar, his writing concerning the curse and concerning the flood. Now we have to go back to the curse because we've had great changes after the curse, just like we had after the flood. Or to say it another way, we're going to be looking at some great changes that took place after the flood, but that wasn't the first time that we have an introduction to different laws and different features in animals, in man, in plants, in the whole world in general, because we've already seen this take place earlier in Genesis chapter 3 with the fall of man. This writer says the following: only a very careful look at Scripture will reveal the actual implications of the curse. The account of the curse is presented in Genesis 3, verses 14 through 19. I just selected some paragraphs to read because they're outstanding. And this is outstanding to begin with. The third sentence in this paragraph. He says, the curse is pronounced on 3 recipients: the serpent, the woman, and the ground. Well, do you notice any problems so far? What about Genesis 3:15, one of the most famous verses in the Old Testament? That's a curse on Satan, not the serpent. So he's missed Satan here entirely. One thing that's interesting, I noticed in all of their writings, they never mention Satan, as though he had nothing to do with the fall of man. It's an evolutionary process that man is getting better and not worse. They never mention him at all. It's just that these various laws came into existence when man came into existence, however he came into existence, which they believe was in some evolutionary fashion. Then we can rule out Satan, we can rule out that form of evil and attribute evil to something else. What? They can't really answer. In the case of the ground, however, it's not the ground itself, but the man Adam who's addressed by God, which is certainly true. The curse is pronounced on the ground for Adam's sake. Nowhere in the narrative is it said that the entire cosmos underwent any kind of drastic transformation. And nowhere is it said that the animal world experienced sudden structural changes, such as lions, for example, suddenly developing large canine teeth for freshly arisen carnivorous tendencies. And we're going to begin to get into some of these things next week. So we'll come back and mention some of these same arguments and some of the answers to them that he's mentioning here. But you see, he doesn't like anything sudden. He said nowhere in the narrative is the entire cosmos said to have undergone any type of drastic transformation. What does he want? He wants a slow, uniformitarian, evolutionary, build-up, or degeneration, either way you want it, as long as it's slow. But he's saying, don't give me any of this immediate stuff, because we need several million years to fit into our theory. And if you're saying that these things are immediately taking place, that it didn't take years and years for the lion to develop canine teeth, like we know the lion to have today, if you're saying that it didn't take years for all of this, then you're ruining our theory. The curse on the serpent, he picks this out in a hurry, cannot be extrapolated to the total animal kingdom. It is true that the Authorized Version says that the serpent is cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field, suggesting that the cattle and beasts of the field were also cursed, but to a lesser degree than the serpent. If you look back in Genesis, I'll show you where he's talking about, and it is a very interesting few sentences that we have here. Genesis 3 and verse 14. God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle. The implication is if they're not cursed, they are participating in the curses and in the fault. And above every beast of the field, upon thy belly thou shalt go, dust thou shalt eat all the days of thy life. You see, what he's saying here is that it's merely a relative statement that the other animals really weren't cursed. The serpent was all that was cursed. As a matter of fact, he goes on, and I quote, to say the following: the thought is not that of comparison, as though the Lord had said that all the beasts would be cursed, but that the serpent would be cursed more than any. Rather, in the curse, the serpent is separated from the other beasts. Whereas they are free, he is now in a peculiar bondage. Upon him alone of all the beasts does God pronounce the curse, for he alone had tempted the woman. And so he thinks that reason makes sense here. Why punish the other beasts when it wasn't their fault? But we can say the same thing. Why punish men today? It's not our fault that Adam and Eve sinned. But the whole Bible teaches that you can be judged on the basis of someone else's sins that they have committed. And the Bible from cover to cover says that we're judged guilty because Adam was judged guilty.
Amen.
Now, if that's true, why not the rest of creation participating in the fall, even though they didn't have any first-hand actions into what happened as far as the serpent and his conversation with Eve? I wouldn't say that all the other animals were immediately cursed, but I would say they participated in the effects of the fall, which is really saying the same thing. It's not that God had to say, now I curse you cattle because you sinned. They didn't do anything. He did say that to the serpent, I curse you because of what you've done. That's what we're reading here in Genesis 3 and verse 14. But regardless of whether they actually sinned and received some type of immediate curse, which I don't believe they did, they nonetheless suffered the consequences of man's fall into sin. And of course, man's fall into sin spills over into all of creation, which is what we're going to be looking at later on in Romans. He makes the point, quotes another scholar and says the curse was not pronounced upon all beasts, but upon the serpent alone. That's true. The curse was not pronounced upon them, but they still participated in all the evil effects and death and pain and adversity that the world had to offer after this. Here's another statement that he makes. The fact that thorns and thistles will come forth for man does not mean that thorns and thistles did not exist before the fall. Well, then what does it mean then? I mean, the clear implication is that they didn't exist before the fall, and as a result, this is your punishment. But you see, they don't want to see anything that just suddenly happens, because that involves a denial, or at least a suspension, of the first law of thermodynamics. You're going to have creation now. It didn't say that God was going to, get a plant or a seed and plant a thorn and it was going to come forth. He said right now they're going to start coming forth. And they much prefer seeing some type of evolutionary process in work, because that way they can say that our laws of thermodynamics and the conservation of law and energy and entropy, they are in effect, and they've always been in effect, and this is the way things have always been, which is simply not the case. He goes on, another paragraph, Scriptures do not say anywhere whether or not animals died before the fall. The only mention of death in the Genesis account is with reference to man. If man eats the forbidden fruit, then in the day he eats thereof, he shall surely die. And he ingeniously goes on to deduce from that the fact that how could God's, the punishment of death, or the thought of the punishment of death that he more or less suspended over Adam while he was giving him a period of probation to see whether or not he would obey him or disobey him, how could that really have any effect upon Adam if Adam had never seen anything die. In other words, Adam would have no concept of death unless he had seen death before. So they try to bring up all these rationalistic arguments, humanistic arguments, against what the clear teaching of the Word of God is. You see, the Bible does teach that there had been no death in the animal kingdom prior to the fall of man. He doesn't like that, doesn't believe that. Because then you're going to end up with a literal 24-hour creation days as well as a 7-day creation week. And they want this into thousands of years and millions of years. And it won't fit their theory. From your book, Genesis Flood, I have some other things to read along the same line. Gets into a very dangerous area when they start ruling out the fact that there could really have been such drastic but nonetheless immediate changes in creation that we see as a result of the fall. I mean, immediately Adam was condemned to die. That happened immediately. Now, whether he died physically or not has nothing to do with the fact that he died spiritually whenever he disobeyed God, and that's why they have to receive forgiveness and receive covering by blood later on in chapter 3. Now here we go with some more of these rationalistic arguments. Another writer says, so far as we can see, the existence of carnivorous beasts, including insect-eating birds, is necessary to preserve the balance of nature. Without this type of bird, the insect life would soon destroy vegetation, and even apparently harmless little animals like rabbits may become a scourge if there are no foxes to keep their numbers in check, as was abundantly illustrated in Australia some years ago. You see what he's doing? He's basing the world of that day on the world of our day, saying that the world of that day had to have the same balance of nature as the world of our day has. Certainly, we have to have this balance today. If you didn't have your predatory type animals, then your insects, they would overrun the whole world. Your rabbits, if you didn't have foxes and things to eat rabbits, they multiply so fast, they would overrun the world, they would eat all the vegetation, everyone would end up dying as a result of it. There have been now certain changes and certain laws set into effect whereby we do have flesh-eating, carnivorous animals as well as birds today, because that does keep balance of nature. But who's to say that had to be the case back when there was no evil, there was no pain, there was no sin, there was no adversity? Who's to say that the world of our day has to be the same as the world of their day? The Bible tells that was an entirely different world. That was paradise. And we certainly don't live in paradise. We attend the paradise, but we wouldn't be attending here if we lived in paradise, because we wouldn't have to be built up from the Word of God and overcome the devil. The devil wouldn't be around.
That's right. Hallelujah.
Certainly the world of that day is entirely different from the world of our day.
Hallelujah.
And the argument that we would have an overrunning of the whole world by these various unwanted rodents and creatures that we didn't need, remember, that was only a very short period of time, several weeks or several months at the most, between creation and all that happened and the fall and then the institution of carnivorous appetites and tendencies in animals. It didn't last like 10,000 years. It was only several months. We could go several months now and they're not going to overrun the whole world. But even if it had lasted for several thousands of years, God would have had some divine way to keep things in check and to keep a balance in nature then. How? I don't know how he would have had it. But he would have had some way to keep everything in balance and in check in that day. We've got certain fundamental laws that are in check today, and that is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and man eat dog. And you see one animal eating another animal and another animal eating another one, and sure enough, things pretty much stay in check. He goes on to say it would require an entirely different system in nature from the present in order to exclude death from the world. To the existing system, it is as essential as gravitation, and apparently just as much a law of nature. The conclusions from all these facts and reasonings are that death is an essential feature of the present system of organized nature, that it must have entered into the plan of creation in the divine mind originally, and consequently must have existed in the world before the apostasy of man. This is a different writer, but he's making the same serious scriptural blunder here in saying that death is an essential part of the balance of nature, and it would have to have existed even prior to the death or prior to the sin of man. The universe must contain all possible ranges of goodness. One of these grades of goodness is that it can fail in goodness. That's one of the ranges of goodness, is that you can fail in goodness. If there were nothing corruptible, or if there were no evil men, this is their basic reasoning. This was the same as the reasoning of Thomas Aquinas. He said that if there were no evil men in the world, then the world would be absent of many good things. Now, what he means by that, that's a very logical reasoning there, because you can bring up a whole lot of things. Think about that. If there were no evil men, then we would have an absence of many good things in the world. Let me give you an example. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is a good thing. There would be no forgiveness if there were no evil men. So in other words, they're saying we have to have as much evil as we can in the world so that we can get as much good out of the world as possible. It doesn't make any sense at all. Not when you're taking us prior to Genesis chapter 3. It simply doesn't fit. And they go on and on, really, they get the argument of reasoning the sin and the evil in the world back to God himself, because they never mention Satan, and they don't mention the fall of man as being the result of all this, and the only being we're left with is God, that he somehow is the originator of all of the evil that we see in the world. If you look here in Romans chapter 5 and verse 12, a verse never to forget, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin.
Amen.
And so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned.
Amen.
1 Corinthians 15 and verse 21. For since by man came death, then by man came also the resurrection of the dead. Death came by man. Death didn't come because we needed death in order to keep nature in balance and in check. Death came by man. That is, by man's sin. The same chapter in verse 26, this doesn't sound like pre-fall conditions to me, friends. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And you're going to say that there were enemies in the world before there was any evil in the world. How can you have an enemy and not have any evil? They have to coexist with one another. If you've got enemies, you've got evil. If you've got evil, you've got enemies. And if death is considered to be an enemy, and they're saying it existed all the way back from Genesis 1:1, that death existed there, then we're also going to have to say that evil existed that early. And then we've got the problem of Genesis chapter 1 and verse 31. That he had looked at the whole creation, and behold, everything was very good. Romans chapter 8, verses 19 through 22 is the third text that speaks to our situation that we're discussing now. Now this just will introduce the fact that there have been tremendous changes after the fall, after the flood. And they are attributed to the sins of mankind. The earnest expectation of the creation waited for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creation was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected the same in hope. Because the creation itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And it's believed by all conservative scholars that Paul has reference here to the Genesis 3 account of man's falling into sin. And if that's true, then the only deduction that we can reason from that is that this vanity and bondage of corruption that creation is now experiencing had to have come about as a result of man's fall into sin. It's the only logical scriptural deduction that you can get from these passages here, that death in the area of self-conscious and conscious death, which we'll explain in a later message, had to have come after Genesis 3 and couldn't have come before, which means that we would have had to have had some other type of balance in nature prior to this time. Now they go on and on and on, reasoning about how man couldn't have been totally a vegetarian. Animals couldn't have been totally vegetarians. There would have had to have been the partaking of some meat. And that's why one of the things we mentioned last time as far as man after the flood, it says that now I give you, the privilege and the authority to eat meat. They say, well, that doesn't mean that man wasn't allowed by God to eat meat prior to that time. Well, then why does he say, now I give you the privilege, but I already gave you the privilege way back in Genesis 1 because I wanted to keep nature in check? It doesn't say anything like that. The privilege and the right for mankind by God to partake of meat comes only after the flood. You see, that's why we have to study the fall, the effects of the fall, the effects of the flood together, because they all tie in together. And there are going to be physiological changes in creation. I'm talking about the animals, the birds, the insects, the reptiles, the fish. After the fall, just like there will be physiological changes after the flood. And so I think we'll stop there and start next time on looking at some of the faunal effects of the flood, that you first of all have to have down basically these three texts, Romans 5, Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 15, to realize that animals just weren't always like what they are today. Something had to have occurred to bring about and to necessitate these changes in them. If we see that that's the sin of man, then we can go back to Genesis 3, and although we don't have a lot of clear teaching on this happened to this creature and this happened to that one, then on the basis of these New Testament passages, we still can nonetheless come to some reasonable scriptural deductions about what the animal and plant kingdom would have been like prior to and after the fall, as well as prior to and after the flood. Things today are not the way things used to be.
Amen.
The world of our day is not the same as the world of their day. But we have seen these changes come about.
For a complete